The 20th century saw three pandemics. The most notorious, the 1918 so-called Spanish flu. 1957, the Asian flu. In the late 60s, the Hong Kong flu. First, the notorious so-called Spanish flu of 1918.
Perhaps until recently, Spanish flu has been what some people call a forgotten pandemic. But it was a huge global calamity. In terms of the number of deaths, we're saying 50 to 100 million, far greater than the casualties of the First World War. Roughly around April, May 1918, when the carnage of the First World War is graphic and horrendous. But at the same time, this unknown enemy is starting to sweep through the US, Europe, the trenches, and it is recorded by the Spanish press, and it becomes dubbed as the Spanish flu.
How bad was the 1918 so-called Spanish flu? This is historian Roger McGrath.
Well, if you want a real flu pandemic, then go back to 1918, 1919, because it took millions worldwide. But here in the United States, with a population of less than 1/3 of what we have today, it took 675,000 lives.
So, adjusted for today's population, we're talking about 1.5 million Americans on a population-adjusted basis. Now, what measures did state and local and federal governments take in order to mitigate the Spanish flu? And did those efforts actually work?
There was no national effort. This was principally a local effort, and so then they varied. And you'd see some cities took all sorts of precautions and quarantine and closings, and other cities did nothing. And the differences were nil. Some of the cities that had the very lowest death rates did very little about it. You had other cities order their citizens to wear masks, which did nothing, but they thought it might have some positive effect, and closed down certain areas and businesses and closed schools, and it really seems to have made no difference one way or the other.
Now, there was another pandemic in the late 60s, circa 1968, 1969, early 1970, that some call the Hong Kong flu.
I have, in fact, had 6 children's, and also my colleague down in Hamilton has isolated what we call the A2 Hong Kong 68 strain of influenza.
Which is the one that happened last year and is still on the round.
That's right. We had this virus in Toronto in December of 68 and in January of 69, and then it departed these shores and visited the United Kingdom and the continent, and then off it went down for the winter season, down into the southern hemisphere, and came back this time to North America, this time rather to the continent first. And the debt has been repaid from last year, and it's now visiting this part of the world from the continent.
How bad was it? Pretty bad. And France? Well, France was hit particularly hard. But the French were philosophical about it, and they never closed down their economy.
And yet, for the time being, the death toll is higher from that period of 1968 to 1970 when you had the Hong Kong flu here in France. You had an astounding number of 1/3 of rail workers in France, 1/3 of postal workers who were laid off, who were off work because they were sick at the time. And yet, as Anne-Marie was saying, people didn't really talk about it much. They got on with their lives, they say.
Une famille où nous avons des carcasses de fer, nous ne prenons jamais rien. Autrement dit que nous sommes invulnérables.
De toute façon, si on l'a, ben on l'a. On ne peut rien y faire.
Il n'y a pas lieu de s'affoler, parce que cette épidémie évoluera probablement comme une épidémie saisonnière assez banale.
The UK was also hit hard, again, never shut down their economy. Well, how bad was it here in America, and how concerned was the media? This is from the New York Times, January 18, 1970. Absenteeism resulting from the flu is running as high as 50% in Norway and parts of France. Some 30% of West Berliners and Northern Germans are said to be suffering from the illness. Soviet health authorities, worried about the outbreak, are hoping to give 30 million flu vaccinations to factory workers. The Hong Kong flu has largely spared the United States so far this winter, and experts are predicting there will be no epidemic. There is no indication that the individual case of this winter's influenza is more severe than those of last year in France, end of quote. No epidemic, let alone no pandemic? This is what the CDC said about the Hong Kong flu. The estimated number of deaths was 1 million worldwide and almost 100,000 in the United States, end of quote. 100,000. Now think about this. This is when our population was 100 million fewer people. Adjusted for today's population, you're talking about 130,000 Americans dying on an adjusted population basis of the Hong Kong flu. Now, how does that compare with the predictions of the current coronavirus?
Today, a former director of the CDC testified on Capitol Hill that the nation is still at the beginning of this pandemic, and he has no doubt the number of people who die from coronavirus in the U.S. will reach 100,000.
It's really bad. In New York City, it's on the order of the 1918-1919 pandemic. More than 20,000 people, when you look at all of the excess deaths in the last 2 months, killed in less than 2 months. That is as bad as the worst phase of the pandemic 100 years ago. Even now, with deaths decreasing substantially, there are twice as many deaths from COVID in New York City as there are on a usual day from all other causes combined. And sadly, looking at the US as a whole, just calculating forward from the number of people whose infections have already been documented, there will be, tragically, at least 100,000 deaths from COVID by the end of this month.
Now, adjusted for population, we're talking again about 130,000 Americans. 1968, 1969, dying from the so-called Hong Kong flu. That was the same year, by the way, 1969, that the famous rock concert Woodstock was held. Now, what did a co-promoter of Woodstock recently tell Reuters about how he felt about the flu during that year? Here's what he said. Woodstock was not partying in defiance of pandemic containment measures because at the time of Woodstock, there was no pandemic and there were no containment measures to defy. In the months following the December-January peak of the pandemic, the flu all but disappeared. By mid-1969, any preoccupation with the virus had given way to widespread unconcern. Media coverage had dwindled to virtually zero, end of quote. Now, what measures did federal, state, and local authorities take to combat and mitigate the Hong Kong flu? John Funn writes for the National Review. Here's what he said. During the Hong Kong flu, Americans rode buses less often, washed their hands, and practiced social distancing, but they went to work. Marilyn Brown worked for the LA Department of Social Services during the Hong Kong flu. Other than my co-workers bringing their own alcohol to wipe down their desks and wipe down pencils and not use pencils that clients had used, we didn't do anything. A now retired professor of medicine wrote that his 2-year-old daughter contracted the first known case of the Hong Kong flu to hit Europe. How things change, he noted. The stock market did not plummet. We were not besieged by the press. Men in breathing apparatus did not invade my daughter's playgroup. Joel Hay, a professor of pharmaceutical economics, told me that the role of science has changed. We're being bombarded with data, but we often act like the guy who looks for his keys under the lamppost because the light is better there. We aren't asking more fundamental questions, like, does this $20 trillion experiment in lockdowns actually work? End of quote. And that 24/7 news cycle that has to be fed certainly adds to the alarmism. Susan Craddock, professor at the Institute for Global Studies at the University of Minnesota, told the Wall Street Journal that 24-hour news coverage, social media, and heightened public anxiety mean today's leaders face far more pressures to do something. The thing elected officials fear most is social stigma from challenging the conventional wisdom, said Colorado State Senator Vicky Meeker. Johan Gusecki, Sweden's former chief epidemiologist, bluntly said on Swedish radio recently that harsh lockdowns make little sense, and that it's the rest of the world that's conducting an experiment in lockdowns based on shaky models. In Sweden, People are encouraged to stay home, but stores, restaurants, and offices remain open. Better to have social distancing people can live with for months than severe lockdowns that get reimposed if cases rise once they're lifted. End of quote. In short,
we've had a rather soft attitude in this country to the control of the pandemic, doing more by asking people to behave than by writing ordinances and laws and policing.
To end this video that contrasts our response to today's pandemic with that of 1968, 1969, I leave you with the words of the fountainhead's Ayn Rand.
What we need today, what I call the new intellectual, would be any man or woman who is willing to think. Meaning, any man or woman who knows that man's life must be guided by reason, by the intellect, not by feelings, wishes, whims, or mystic revelations. Any man or woman who values his life and who does not want to give in to today's cult of despair, cynicism, and impotence, and does not intend to give up the world to the dark ages and to the rule of the collectivist brute.
Now remember that date, June 19th. That's the premiere of my new documentary, Uncle Tom. And check out the trailers on UncleTom.com. Here's one.
I don't remember the actual day, but I remember the emotion that I felt when it happened.
I'm often asked, was there an epiphany?
I started asking questions.
As I became more politically aware,
a lot of the way that I saw things began to change.
All of this information I've been taking in for several years.
A continuation of these kind of contradictions.
I had bought into all of these lies.
You begin to see what the real agenda is.
That's usually how that red pilling process begins.
Black America is starting to get it.
People are starting to realize what's going on.
Coming to a home theater near you, I'm Larry Elder, and we've got a country to save. And I'll see you next time.